Hello everyone, today we talk about the role and function of the beast warriors in primitive Germanic societies. Actually, we never made a video on the berserkers or the úlfhéðnar. At some point we'll have to fill that gap. I'll talk here specifically about the interpretative problems that we have in an otherwise comparable dimension that mostly pertains to Indo-Europeistics, and fundamentally we'll discuss this in part today about the role of these individuals, and we'll see that their role actually changed over time. We hinted at it partially, if I'm not wrong, in that video about the organization of Viking armies, where we observed en passant the transformation of the role of figures like berserkers throughout the Viking era. But this is something that naturally has much older roots, right, that are also in common to basically all peoples in the world at some level, and that definitely also the Indo-European tradition shows, as we were saying before, as we'll see better now, also with a lot of parallelisms. Think about the Roman world, the Hellenic world, the Vedic world, and so on. But that also went beyond. Right, this video is technically dedicated to our series on the history of chivalry. I mean, realizing that these brotherhoods of beast warriors actually are the same. Were the same. First of all, they were a universal military system at some point. Right, these were apparently always, at least in this specific period. We will start talking from Tacitus times to the Battle of Dublin of 1171, right? So this is mostly the time span of today's video, but they actually pertained to a world where this could be even universal at some point, right? Where there was really Indo-European societies were primitive and nomadic and had this necessity of creating these brotherhoods, but over time, through sedentarization, also the transformation of Germanic and known societies, these individuals took on a different meaning, different role, right? They were gradually detached from the rest of society so much that by the end of this period, you'll see that they were fundamentally attached a negative stigma to, for reasons that are not just Christianization, right? But going parallel with the centralization of the political and social systems that the same that had originally had these people, hang like that, and that also were changing in nature throughout all the path. Sometimes at some point during the full Viking age, let's say that the berserker was not just a furious beast warrior like you could find those Germanic mercenaries hired by Trajan during the Dacian campaign. There were something more. There were even hyper specialized troops, very skilled in individual combat. It's not just blind fury, but it's a set of techniques and skills that also derive also from. This is all about the religious military understanding of the world that these peoples had. It was universal at some point back in the day, but we see towards the late Viking period that the berserkers would have been known by any Scandinavian farmer as essentially brigands, right, and essentially negative figures, people that lived at the outskirts of the world just to raid and pillage, as that had been functional to the ancient world, where that was literally the only way they could go on, and that at that point towards the 11th century, 12th century, didn't work anymore because societies had developed, had improved, they had properly civilized, and that way of living was incompatible with civil development of those communities. And this is interesting. This is pointed out also in some of the least stratified and hierarchized communities in Europe, such as the Nordic ones at the time. So it's not even a matter of saying it's because somewhere this thing remained functional. Yeah, maybe at the outskirts of the world in the Ugro-Finnic realities and so on, but we see from the Tale of Igor's campaign, we'll read afterwards, that even in the Russian world, that the thing had been paralleled by a more advanced development. But what I leave you today with, hopefully, is the realization that this way of living had a common root that we will have to analyze carefully at some point in another video. We'll dedicate multiple videos to this topic in detail, to basically all human societies in a way. That's why we start also with this comparative picture, right? Because speaking of Indo-Europeistics, today the most updated historiographical acquisitions basically tell us, yes, that Indo-Europeistics in part is surpassed as long as we realize that these symbolisms, the wolf, the eagle, and so on, were shared also by non-Indo-European peoples, right? They existed among the Egyptians, they existed in China. They were part of a, as we were saying before, in fact, of a common, let's say, relation and mindset and vision of the world and existence that humans had to cope with the reality, in fact, their own realities that brought to this warlike behaviors that were deeply tied to literally a moral train, not just a physical, an extremely brutal and abusive and nightmarish, process of training at that point. It is all initiatic rites were fundamentally about, that left very strong marks in societies, as we'll see now, especially with the Roman one, and that, however, can be better approached by still looking at the old historiographical acquisitions, right? We're talking here of, for our historical understanding, for our historical setting, of a few individuals, right? We start from a time, Tacitus times, where, the Germans are properly to be considered still a prehistorical people, right? When they met the Romans, they were, their political and social development was still uncontaminated by a certain degree to display certain features that we find in other primitive peoples. And that is very precious, but unfortunately still Roman information is, albeit we should be extremely thankful for it, it's naturally subjective in a way, and it also, it's not infinite, right? We're lucky we have it in the first place, so much that part of the reason why we kind of fixated at a certain point just with the idea of that this was a Nordic thing is exactly because of the strained relationships between the Romans and the Germans, historically speaking. But this thing existed back in the day, also in the Roman society, in moments that, for example, the Romans were not so documented like the Germans were via the Romans later on. So sometimes we have this blank spaces for which we say, okay, we don't know, but if we study those societies, we realize that it was the same thing, right? Bear warriors or other animals are to be found everywhere. They're found in Siberia, found in North America. It's basically the same identical thing, right? Even certain ways of living, certain material cultures. I don't know. The early Germans were very similar to the even, I don't know. Think about clothing to Native Americans. There is these were words that, in fact, that's the shared background that talking about before, and therefore we have to be very careful also at understanding what what we know exactly. About our documentation for what these customs represented for those populations that we're describing, these peoples, right? In the case of the Romans, for example, it's very fascinating because that warlike ethos was very close to the primitive one. Rome had not emerged from many centuries. The first time the Romans met the Germans at levels of development that were particularly different, even just from the Celts. The Celts had the same thing, right? It's just less documented in a way. We have mostly the sagas that later on, also in a time that also had acquainted the Germanic world with Christianization and so on, tells us about this long-lasting tradition, because finally someone put in written form, right? The world societies were already acquainted with literature, had a literature in the first place that could transcript all these oral traditions and profitable. But it's a coincidence, right? And we have to be very thankful in that sense, also just for having them, in spite of the bias, in spite of the misunderstandings, but also realizing that against any ideological position one could take, objectively what we know, like as moderns, we tend to dismiss usually the scientificity of a certain expression, right? But we often forget, and this is what every historian actually knows, that whatever's been written doesn't matter how biased it is, because every source at the time was biased, right? Even these same stories are biased within the same pattern that they wanted to apply to society. These were fiction, right? Aside from the beliefs, they surely were there, but also reality is different. But we must understand that source, even in that bias, is documenting something historical, right, about that time, about that society. So we're talking here about, this is in theory, a military history video. So we'll cut it chiefly on the base of, who were these men in relation to society, but also properly as warriors, right? What was their role? So they were quite, what we understand here is they were quite distinct from the mass of free warriors at this point, also in Germanic societies. And especially, at least until a certain moment, also the object of mistrust, fear, right? Real at first, and then ritualized in those same societies that had created them. There is an author that, as I can't say it's controversial, because if you know the historiographical background setting here, there's not. But today, it's, people do not like to quote him very much, but he actually wrote extremely beautiful things. He was a historian of religion, not a historian of military historian, but he wrote astonishingly beautiful thing. You're talking about Georges Dumézil, who, because of his political views, is considered like a sort of, not so even crypto-fascist, some in the Indo-Europeistic perspective of it, like the stressing chiefly the Indo-Europeistic side of these traditions. His studies are astonishingly important, and they're still recognized by historiographically as such, right? It's not because something is, it's maybe it's not updated or hasn't taken consideration some perspective. It's not worth studying it. It's one of those milestones from which you start reading these things, right? And more or less at the time, more or less everybody had kind of debatable ideas compared to our standards. But objectively, his work is astonishingly beautiful. If you've never read one of his work, please do it. Right? There are certain things about the religion of the Germans, the one of Camillus. It's all about looking at the broader spectrum of Indo-European peoples from Rome to Vedic India to Hellenic mythology to the Nordic societies, etc., and realizing, of course, that it was basically all the same, right? They shared the same values, they shared the same view of outlook on the world. It was brutal. There's no doubt about this, but this is exactly the point. We study these things for understanding why it was brutal, right? Whereas most people just say, it was brutal, so it's bad, we don't have to study it. No, it's brutal. And it's human, so whatever it is, we must study it and understand it very clearly, and understand it that differently from what people do today. These people behaved like that because they actually had very few choices, right? And Dumézil's interpretation is, it's not because of the ideology, right, of the author, that actually it's not even this huge deal, but it's properly about the fact that he had a kind of general and schematic, at least apparently, interpretation, right? But it's nevertheless remarkable, not only because it is supported by the doctrine and authority of a great scholar like he was, but also because it offers an interpretative key at this level, both in cultural and sociological terms, of the role of certain outlaw groups within traditional societies, right? The leitmotif of this video, and also of others that we will make about this topic, is naturally the intrinsic tension that has become, a big topic of for Schwerpunkt, between the the creation of a state, of a civilized, developed, articulate society with an authority, with a discipline, with a control, right? And this more primitive, kind of more, looser from a political cohesion point of view, warlike, the deregulated societies like these ones were. And the intrinsic tension that brought within the same to arrive to the state, because these are the same societies, at the end of the day, abandoned, as we've seen, the same models. And here we have to propotently look into mythology, because otherwise we can understand a very few. Also because most of the sources that talk about this that look back to that past. So, in other words, the berserkers should be approached to figures even like the Indian Gandharvas and their Hellenic relatives like the centaurs. They are both semi-human and semi-equine demons, right? And here we will properly have to stress the connection between wolf and horse at the core of the Indo-European, nomadic society of the steppe. So the horse and the wolf, right, as these, properly, and the development of knighthood, as we were saying before, through the compenetration of these models. And another great and, fascinatingly documented example, definitely in the Roman world, Romulus Caelus, the speedy ones, right? These bloodthirsty kidnappers of flocks and women, right? That were at the properly mythologically at the foundation, mythologically / historically, where there was no difference at the beginning, right? At the foundation of Rome herself, right? These were Romulus' retinue, bodyguards on horseback, right? That, as you know, may committed the famous rape of the Sabine women, slaughtered the man, took the women. That tells so much. These are legions, and that arrived much later, like through the same Roman filter out of their own society, but they are actually pretty spot on. Like the lifestyle of those ancient brotherhoods of warriors that seized power, control, and for also culturally these models of conquest and of rule, and what the imperium is at the end of the day is based on this model, right? So to say how close actually these realities were, not just culturally but properly in time, right? Rome was feudal up to the 4th century. I mean, it was exactly the same thing. We're dramatically close to the Celtic world, basically identical in terms of political and military edus and development and even weaponry and so on. Also, this other aspect of Roman religion, the one of Februs, right, from which also February comes from, in fact, patron of the Roman Equites, which in mid-February ran for Rome as Luperci. What is this about? Well, mid-February here was in the month in which the exercise of the Flamines, that is the igniter of fire of the altar of sacrifices, like, the sacred fire of all Indo-European religions, was interrupted by multiple ritual prohibitions, which meant essentially in this cold winter the ritual death that didn't pass just through a ritual death of nature and so on, but of society, and the moment in which fundamentally the light was obscured and was taken by these wolves, the same Flamines, the same priests basically, wore this wolf skins and ran for Rome as raiders, literally, in naturally symbolically at some point. They were connected not just to the lupus, to the wolf, but to the equites as well, because the Roman knights were in that sense that the Romans, contrarily to was commonly believed by the secularizing and modernizing interpretation of history, were dramatically keen on cavalry. They cared extremely on it, and this connection between the wolf and the horse is all part of this shamanic trance that we can see also in the Germanic world, through which the ritual passage where the initiatic rites of the young warriors were carried out, where this vision with this fury, this properly what brought eventually this bear or wolf warriors to take on their role, to their new identity, was performed, and with drums, that typical kind of step instrument that were to resemble the galloping of horse in the process. The wolf was about the warrior side of it. The horse was the also the same thing, but properly this chthonic and Apollonian symbolism of the horse that can bring the medium, the connection between the sky and the earth, right? The sky where the military glory descended from, and the earth where the blood, the mud, the decomposition, the afterlife, this past, as we've seen with Fabrus in Rome, this moment of obscurity where the transition had to happen, where it could be a regeneration, right? That was connected, particularly in all these cases, not just with the obvious connection between man and animal, but specifically with the idea that this young man in nomadic, semi-nomadic societies were very well documented all over, even among the Italic peoples and so on, had to, for needs of demographic and economical reasons, to abandon every spring at their adulthood, their abode, their homes, to go out as brotherhoods of warriors to literally seek a new land, which meant taking it from someone else that is fighting. So these were devoted, they were religious devotees and military and warriors fundamentally, that had to seize land, women, and start their own thing again. This is essentially the same difference between in the Germanic world between the Sippe and the Comitatus, right? So the idea that there is a kind of a farming, agricultural, sedentary society that is less warlike because it can live with more resources, but at the same time, this shortcomings, these imbalances with production, demographics, etc., as it's well exemplified by all the various Germanic migrations that push towards the south, the Celtic world, and beyond, were about sending these young men, in the age of maturity, so that when they are more violent, more aggressive, more sexually active, to go search to put that strength at the service of violence, essentially, or to use violence through that, and to seize their own new space in the world. And this could happen only in a militarized fashion, because wherever you went, there was somebody who was standing against you, and therefore it was either victory or death. And this is exactly where all this mystics and this of violence and ferocity and even individual disruption, as we will see better at this point, stemmed from. The idea that but this is true for everybody, for the Germanic comitatus, from the Gaelic fiannas, all the military brotherhoods you find in the warrior brotherhoods you find all over these worlds were based on this, that when you entered these brotherhoods, you were possessed by the divinity. You were not free anymore, right? Your life didn't count, because it was all about, in these stateless societies, to maintain a collective discipline that otherwise this man would lack, right? The result was not extraordinary. Mostly, this world had enough resources just to give this dramatic individual skill, right? But whereas, the collective dimension of it was, the Sippe did better. The Sippe was about properly organizing the villages, under chieftains, and congregating this. But still, these brotherhoods were considered somewhat elite. So were considered the ones that would break into the Eminem first, would retreat later, that would make the dirtiest job, but also the one more loaded with glory, right, and recognition, so that these were properly, as if there had been military professionals out there. There were a few that were detached from society because they were dangerous, right, because they properly didn't belong to it anymore at some level, and it could just hope, and I've not read much on this passage, but properly we'll have to expand on this, to create their own new place. Because at the end of the day, as we were saying before, this vision was all one with the pre-existing view of society. Where these peoples moved from the Caucasus, from the Don, into Europe, these were nomadic people, so basically at that time, it's not that there was a distinction between the Sippe and the Comitatus. This was all, in the European world, it was all one, right? It's just with the sedentarization of the Western Indo-Europeans that we find this obvious detachment. The majority of people will start living sedentary, but these pockets of warriors were still functional to the system. Now, as we were saying before, in all these cases, we will notice the connection between man and animal. Man and horse, right, that from the prosaic Roman religiosity were transformed into the equites, right, the man-horse as the equus proper, that had privileges in Roman societies, right, that would remain for a long time. Thinking about the fact that there were these equites, equa publico, that means that the community had to pay a horse for, which was against the ideal of the citizen soldier. There, it's as if these guys had been privileged. Still, those brotherhoods were similar, right? Because it was recognized that these were somewhat the spearhead of the thing, and that society had to somewhat pay for having them, or to maintain them, but still in a not fully functional, and in fact, in this sense, kind of contradictory system in which otherwise the rest of society would live like, right? The man-wolf, right, who later became the man-who defends also from the wolf, because here also in terms of knighthood and Christianization, we see the shift, that it's not that this thing ended with Christianization, but there is actually the sacralization of these warriors to defend society from those who had not accepted that order and would become criminals and outlaws and wouldn't find objectively for the same functionment of that society a place anymore. But more of that later. When you look at the Roman signiferi with the bear skin, the wolf skin, the tiger skin, lion skin, it's exactly the same thing. It was them, right? Because they bore the standards that were all sacred, and they were as if they were about the deity of war permeated them, right? Or basically possessed them, so that they would be the most deserving troops to bear that symbol. And everything is religious and military alike. There is no difference in these wars at all, right? Think about the Turk in the Celtic world. We'll speak more of that because of the iron ring of the Catti now in a while. But for the Celts it was the same. And think about the famous episode of Titus Manlius Torquatus that kills the Gaul in the individual combat, and he strips of his Turk and wears his own. And the Romans were famous for wearing Turks themselves, the Roman legionaries. In even later times, and these are Mila and other stuff that were meant exactly to be that, literally, that chain, right? Not something that you could say like as an ornament, as something aesthetic or something, talismanic, apotropaic, simply for the sake of it. No, these people were considering themselves to be devotees of the deity and to have to slaughter the enemies in front of them in the name and on behalf, and actually through the same deity, as if they were literally possessed by it, right? And never underestimate how the ancient world, even in the most advanced societies, always maintain this kind of ethos, right? And it's unfortunate that the Enlightenment has transformed Greece or Rome into kind of a secularized modern state opposite to the one of tribes. It wasn't absolutely anything like that by any political, social, religious, military standard whatsoever, right? Nobody denies that these societies had gone beyond, had somewhat abandoned more of that kind of lifestyle, but the models were identical, right? There was no contraposition actually, and they spoke in political and military and religious terms the same language of the other peoples of the world, so much that there was a shared interaction of these models, of these symbols, of these activities as well, right? So the initiatory warrior element of these semi-ferine outlaws has left evident traces in the myths of the heroes, right? Think about Achilles, right? A serial psychopath, because let's be honest, that's what these men became. They were trained, abused, basically erased as individuals and rebuilt on a completely kind of dehumanized, literally as animals, mindset to kill, right? Because that was the only way in those times. There's no technology, but not even today, I would say, that can compensate that gap.
either you learn to throw yourselves on enemy spears and to fight, with, a limb off, or, a spear transpassing you, like we know the Celts at the Thermopylae, for example, were documented doing. Either you can't make a difference. It's all about moral forces, right? As we were saying before, this is not great because it's not that they have such an enormous collective discipline to compete with the more advanced military system of that time. But surely, from an individual point of view, they're far beyond, right? These are, some of the pinnacles of ancient world. It's difficult even to find a substantive that can define what this was like. This was literal psychophysical possession. It was not a myth. It was not a ritual. It was not an ideal. These people were that, right? They lived and died also because their lives were atrociously short in those conditions for many reasons, but exclusively for that. That was their only deal. Achilles is raised by centaurs, right? Half men, half beasts. Romulus and Remus were suckled by she-wolf, and Latin sources make it extremely clear that by sucking the milk, they were sucking like the Vedic soma, and from their marshal, from Mars himself, basically, that would literally unleash the fury on the battlefield. It's fascinating because the Romans had, for example, split the military deity of the sky, that is Jupiter, from the martial one, that is Mars, right? In the Germanic world, it was all one with Woden, actually, as Tyr is not Mars, it's basically Hercules, if we make a comparison with the Hellenic mythology, and it's another deal. But even in there, famously enough, there is the comparison of the skins, of this magic powers, this extreme force, and it's very similar to that. But the Romans considered themselves exactly the same, right? They're son of the wolf, right? There is no difference with the úlfhéðnar. They're the same identical religion they stem from. And the role of these people, with apparent paradox, is to guarantee the established order within a given civil religious system, right? Which in turn is symbol and guarantee of this superior cosmic order. As we were saying before, these maniples of soldiers were properly meant to have a functional role in those primitive societies, right? They were, as we've seen, the spearheads. They were the ones who had certain privileges and were respected, albeit feared. We're talking about the early Germans here, right? So their ferocious break-in, their systematic and periodic violation of taboos, too. As we'll see better, they drank each other's blood, allows the right to reestablish itself as a renewal and refoundation of orderly living, right? That's where blood and death and initiatic rites, necrophagous animals, right? The wolf eats corpses. These are the undertakers. Those are the ones, the animals that bring the souls of the dead to Odin and in the Valhalla. And that's it's a living death, literally, right? Don't think that even vampires, werewolves, but this is connected to it, right? It's those words. And the fascinating thing is that we all come. Wherever you come from, we come from that mind. I mean, our ancestors lived in that at some point. And this concept of time raised this a regeneration that naturally has to do with this new generations of youngsters that will, either, as we've seen, win or die, and that would, society would keep to produce as warriors. That is the eternal return of the equals, if we were to speak with Nietzsche, but this cyclical view of the world that in pre-Christian times was actually universal, right? Time is infinite. There is this infinite cycle. It's this eternal return to that illud tempus that reflects a perfection of the universe, and has a periodic ritual restoration as a main feature of a traditional society, as well as the guarantee and condition of their being precisely such, right? They have that function in a more evident, scary way, right? They have to show the rest of society that is gradually driving away from that, still that is the deal. And there are interesting considerations we could make, because this thing reactivated in certain historical times during the migration era, right, where the comitatus regained some importance, with also the waves of steppes peoples that re-injected part of these beliefs, the contraction of society, of wealth, of demographics. Think about in the early Middle Ages, and the embracing, even because of Germanic migrations of these ideas, but they stemmed from the Slavic world. It was all the same here, right? It was all the same stock. They all responded to the same functionality. So these warriors are organized specifically in associations that are sacred to vitality, which ensure regeneration. And this fundamental character is that of being composed of young people, right? If you ever wonder, for example, why the Romans had the velites as the younger and the come of age dressed as wolves, right, with wolf skins, but it's exactly the same thing. It's the same exact thing why there were these societies in the Germanic world. These were the young people who had to prove this reckless courage, right, the reckless behavior, to this fanatic behavior, to prove that they could be selected to become eventually the mature warriors that in the process would also gain some kind of wisdom and intelligence, because at the end of the day, that is the deal, right? Woden is not just the god of fury. He is the god of wisdom as well, that it also is necessary to govern, to exercise justice. So even in these societies, it was perfectly understood the connection that exists between authority, violence, right, and the idea that there must be a leader, that somebody is in trust of the situation because has gained that experience on the field, because these are mostly militarized societies, and therefore can know from a political point of view also what is best. So this is a brutal selection. It's the same reason why the Germans were fundamentally, German nobility spent time having fun looking at these guys running naked among spears and watching them die on a regular basis, because that was their deal. It was this kind of world where the only thing that was worth was whether you had the guts to go fighting against the enemy, because this is the only thing they did all the day long, right? That's their entire deal. If you pass that, you can be considered a man. And everybody who has studied anthropology, of course, knows that these rituals these initiatic rituals are present in every society, and sometimes they are some of the most radically violent and torturous and malignant thing you can imagine. I don't know if you ever the newer initiatic rituals, if you've ever read what would they do that. These are physical tortures, right? These people were not tested like a curriculum. These people were literally abused and dispersonalized, erased as individuals to be completely devoted to the religious and military cause. And it was nothing else in this world that mattered, right, for them. And initially, it was true for everybody, right? In these times, things, as we were saying here, start gradually separating for the rest of society. So much when we talk about this this man, also another comparison with Latin world, the term juvenes, which means the young ones, right? And speaking of the raping nature of these military bands, the quote, juvenes Romani sabinas puellas rapuissent errantur, which is easy, you can translate it on your own, and just go look what that actually meant in Latin society back in the day. What did these people did, right? And that was the entirety. These were vicious things, right? It was the literal idea that even kidnapping a woman because you had killed their man meant that the woman had to accept that she had been seized by the better man. This was the only moral standard of those worlds. The only moral standards of the ancient world is that the strongest has the right to rule, and it doesn't give a damn about anybody because the other is either dead or a slave, that is, a non-human being. That is their mindset. Always remember this when you study these societies, the Romans, the Celts, the Germans. These are societies that dehumanize the defeated, because these men have deserved this right in the name of what the Roman called imperium. These other, people had all their own ways of saying, but the same exact thing. That is the faculty to rule, given by the greatest authority in the universe, right? And there is no other way. When you think of slavery, when you think that these were all basically a great slaving societies, right? The Romans were just the ones who had the bigger systems, and that they were in this sense the tribe who had achieved what all the others hadn't. All these other tribal societies in their own smaller scale were basically exclusively about slave trade, right? Of their own people sold to others, but of anybody who would be defeated in that way. It's extremely difficult to tell to a person today, where especially when we have idolized or glorified for ideological reasons that just look at the mental deficiency of an individual, either the Romans or the Celts or the Germans. These were peoples that basically spent their time exclusively thinking of conquering one another. And there is no other vision of the world. The only ultimate duty of a man is conquering the world. This is what they have in their mind. And there cannot be another model. This is the most important thing, right? And of course, civilization adds up something different, right? And here we could really digress a lot, but never forget, even for a single instant, that you will never understand the brutality of that world. And I wish you, for everybody, to not even come remotely close to understand what those wars were about, because those are things that you do not want to know in your lifetime to remain a psychologically balanced person. So let's stop telling the history of these peoples as if they were either good or bad. Let's start understanding that we have to understand them in the first place, and then maybe can talk about, right? And this is true for any other people. There is no other moral system in a tribal world than conquering, slaving, exterminating, and raping your neighbor, because that's the only way they survived. In any continent, at any time, in any culture, that's the only thing, right? So here, the stressing of the violence, of the strength, of the youth, right? That qualifies not much just the age of the man, but specifically the first flourishing of every vital force. These societies, knowing pretty damn well what death was, exalted life in the same way. And on the battlefield, the difference was exactly being as strong as you were, right, to demonstrate that. And you cannot understand this if you have lived in a world where you have not seen 1/3 of children dying, or you're basically controlled by society, and at the point that if you come out of your traditional roles, you're either ostracized to a positive extreme or thrown into a swamp on the other, right? These are things that you cannot understand. These people were driven by moral forces that, fortunately, history of civilization has compensated with something else, because it's something atrocious, to say the least. And this was their only way to make it, right? As Freeman, naturally, civilization found also better ways to tame these people, literally, with political and military strength, so that it's not surprisingly the more intelligent that normally wins in war, not the strongest, right? So that's why we're talking specifically of the role in primitive societies, because these were primitive societies, right? And significantly, speaking of these associations of beast warriors, the Juvenis is the warrior, right? Especially the one who recently, having passed the initiatory rites of puberty, has taken up arms, right? Literally, these people took on another identity. This is what the initiatory role is. They were conferred, usually also an animal guide, a spirit, when the ceremonies happened, usually it was in the wild, right? That's why the outlaws, because literally these people were separated from society. This is, once again, elementary anthropology, this ritual passage is not something that it's something that must be separated from society, as the dead, because this is literally the death of an individual, of that kid that you will not see anymore, and he will die in that atrocious rite of passage and be reborn like a man, and with a man that has acquired a certain amount of qualities of information, of capabilities, of knowledge, and of vision, right? And this could be why these animals, not just the necrophagal symbolism, etc., but literally because these were animals that lived in the woods, and sometimes they had to kill in order to become men. This is very well known in any tribal society everywhere in the world. It functions in the same identical way. And the anomic or extranomic experience in this sense is sacred. It cannot mix with the rest of the world, of the common people. Right, you die and you are reborn, so something happens where you're touched by the divinity, and this is something that cannot be seen. It must be happening somewhere where the rest doesn't know, right? It's just it's obviously an interior process, right? And of young people within a society that is also linked to by close ritual and customary ties, as we were saying before, as only tribal societies can be. And that is naturally proven by the Germans. What we'll see in a while is naturally that next to these guys, there has to be someone else that has already gone through that, right? It was not just sending them out on their own. It was sending them among these brotherhoods that lived like that and needed to teach these kids what they would become. And once again, you would have not liked to know how it was like. Tacitus says something interesting about the Catti, this Western Germanic tribe, that were quite warlike, as you know, these the Cattis young men are not recognized as warriors. That is, they do not acquire civil rights unless after killing an enemy, right? And in here, there is a separate group of individuals who ostentatiously wear, voluntarily, according to Tacitus, hired badges of infamy. Right? It literally says, most valiant men wear an iron ring, which is shameful among those people, as a bond until they acquired the right to free themselves by killing an enemy. Such a custom is very welcome to many of the Catti, and so they turn white, fingered by their enemies and their own people. The beginning of battles always depends on them. Theirs is always the first group, with its shocking appearance, and not even in peace do they present themselves with a more serene face. None of them care about the house, the field, or anything else. They are fed by all those they come to, and they show themselves lavish with the goods of others and contemptuous of their own, until weak old age makes them unsuitable for this continuous hard warrior exercise. Here it's fortissimus quisque ferreum annulum ignominiosum id genti velut vinculum gestat, donec se caede hostis absolvat, plurimis cattorum hic placet habitus, iamque canent insignes et ostibus similar suisque monstrati. Omnium penes os initia pugnarum, haec prima, semper acies visu nova, nam ne in pace quidem vultum meteore mansuescunt, nulli domus aut ager aut aliqua cura, pro ut ad quemque venere aluntur alien prodigies contemptores sui, donec ex sanguis senectus tam durae virtuti impares faciat. This is Tacitus, Germania 31, right? So you understand, these are different from the other freemen. Also from the other warrior, because every freeman is a warrior, right? This is a selected group of warriors that is living in this kind of astonishing way, right? So here, let's try to understand that we're reading Tacitus. So it's something different from what a German would have told you at the time. So here we are but unfortunately we don't have their opinion here, and we are undoubtedly faced with a group of warriors who are privileged, right? They're not just living in this kind of a disturbing way, but they're properly feared and respected, right? And distinguished from the others. Within a people like the captive who value the arts of war in an exceptional way. The custom of carrying a sign of ignominy, which however becomes on the contrary an honorific distinction, is to extent that it is voluntary, right? And as we understand, at least from this text, like constantly accepted. It's a continuous status, and is equivalent to embracing a definitive warrior obligation. This is interesting if you think about Harald Fairhair, right? It is famous now as such, but he was called like the Sheveled because he had vowed not to care about his burden or hair until he had unified all Norway under his power. Right, he succeeded in this after 870, and his nickname significantly changed to that of Fairhair, and is one of most famous figures in Norwegian history. So this tells you that kind of detachment from the rest of from an order, from an equilibrium, until that political military accomplishment is achieved. So it is in fact what we see here, something very similar to the vows of chivalry that we will see flourishing above all between the 14th and the 15th century, but which certainly took up a previous custom. These people vowed themselves, as we've seen. It wasn't just a matter of a lifestyle. They properly had a purpose, right? They had to achieve something, because otherwise, right, why would they have lived like that in the first place? It was this continuous state of testing and of training, right? And it was exhausting from a psychophysical point of view. We'll see this better also from a psychological point of view when we talk about the damnation of the berserker. The fact that already by the Viking Age, this lifestyle was perceived as like a damnation proper, not something functionally positive to such a radically brutal word like the one of the captive. So, and this would already be a sufficient title to give the captive space in this video, but it's not enough, right? We're certainly faced with something more. We're facing with a sacred society that is qualified by a badge, right? That from a sign of infamy becomes a glorious ornament, and those members are allowed to break, right, in the common interest, the usual social duties. These people, as we've seen, as Tacitus says, they do not work. They do not think about the family. They're evidently celibate, right? Even in the much later Icelandic sagas, it is emphasized that the berserker is a bachelor, right? So the community feeds them in exchange for their military commitment as well. So remember, even the Romans pay the extra knights because of that. So what would be a cause for shame for an ordinary man, there is also a title of glory for them, right? To what extent is entering this sort of sacred battalion voluntary, for example, and to what extent does it depend, vice versa, on the possession of certain signs or qualities independent of individual choice, right? Tacitus says that they are the most valiant, right? They fight, they open the battle, they retreat last, But this indication about their valor is generic, right? What does it actually mean? What's their role? It's subjective, it's simplistic, right? And what does that iron ring mean? This is the most important thing. These guys have an iron ring around their necks. And what is also that wandering at the expense of the community, that being fed by everyone, as we've seen, which closely resembles also the condition of a domestic beast at the service of a social group, right? And going to the 13th century, there is, it comes almost natural to recall the example of the Wolf of Gubbio in St. Francis Fioretti, that in that case, this wolf is also perhaps a beast, but also a literal beast, but also an outlaw, or perhaps a werewolf, who knows, right? I know people that have relatives back in the day, including myself, who said that met werewolves, right? And you couldn't tell, was werewolf, is a man or a wolf? It doesn't make sense as a question, right? And in that episode, the wolf makes a pact with Francis, if you know the story. And what is this? Is it a conversion? Is it an exorcism? Right? The Fioretto number 21 says, I entered familiarity through the houses from door to door, without hurting the person and without being done to him. And he was kindly fed by the people, and thus he went about the land and the houses, and no dog barked after him. Right? Doesn't it sound a little bit like Tacitus in here? So such parallelisms do not find an exhaustive answer, because unfortunately we're not so documented about the early Germanic world. But one point is perhaps decisive. The iron ring. The iron ring. The belief that, for example, by wearing an iron collar you can transform yourself into a bear is alive in Danish folklore, right? And it is precisely in the Danish area that the motive of the berserker is longer maintained. Which is fascinating, because Denmark, the Jutland Peninsula, is kind of in between, also in these ages, between the some of the core land of the north, and also enough documented and also developed, given its southern and position, but also simply its greater conditions and development and so on. So we can see there something interesting. This is a truly magical element that could enter into the transformation. The iron ring, as certain sources seem more perspiciously to attest. As there's this beautiful source from high medieval Russia, the tale of Igor's campaign, right, in which Scandinavian motives are ascertainable because of the Kievan Rus, if not easily discernible, in fact, together with, however, other Slavic and Ugro-Finnic ones, that presents the metamorphosis into a werewolf as the voluntary act of a prince magician, we could call him, right? Vezislav, the prince, gave men justice. As a prince the city ruled, but the night wandered in the form of a wolf. This is from the tale of Igor's campaign 159. So here you have even a civilized man, somebody who eventually has this prince magician. Remember the wisdom, the magic, the Vodanic thing, the idea that you have to become a warrior, you have to be a warrior before becoming a ruler, but still here, in high medieval time, we start seeing a connection of something oppositional between the two models, because there is the adversative, right? Vezislav is the prince, gave men justice. He's a just ruler, right? As a prince the city ruled. He's powerful. He's the prince. He's recognized as such. But the night wandered in the form of a wolf. So there is something wrong there, right? There is indeed now, even if you pick the Russian context of the time, objectively it's an advanced context. It is not, primitive tribes. So the fact that this guy is a werewolf, I don't know, would you like to be governed by a werewolf? I don't know, but the link is eloquent, because it tells you that it's as if that role represented the cost that civilization had, that we had to pass through that blood and we cannot lose it completely, that there is something, even in the human existence, and sometimes in the existence exactly of the most gifted, of the great rulers, of good rulers, that passes through a damnation. And this is held true, right? It's kind of a almost Jungian motive, right? But in this text, the sufferings suffered by the wolfmen are only obscurely alluded to, right? It's not clear, for example, to what extent they are determined by the dissociation of the subject into a dual nature. We don't know whether it's the both natures existing, or it's a change, it's a transformation, right? And from what signs onwards, from the divine punishment for the misdeeds of the man-beast, right? And here we open to Christianization, because certainly the Christian authors faced with the legions of such metamorphoses. I mean, these men literally became bears or wolves, right? It could not fail to recall negative models. Think about the infestation of Nebuchadnezzar, right? He was basically humbled by God by being transformed into an animal, to live as an animal in those conditions for 7 years, right? So it's definitely, and it was the punishment of an unjust. Somebody who also had qualities, because he was one of the most powerful rulers. Doesn't it remind you of something? Because, you know, even the Mesopotamian areas are filled with this kind of symbolism of the, of the hawks, of the wolves. We find them there. But even in the Bible, that has a deeper meaning than some, at least medieval Christianity here had more mechanicistically applied, right? Of course, the warrior beast was considered after Christianization as a possessed victim of demonic forces, right? This is proven by the fact that in certain texts, metamorphic features disappear in the baptized berserk. There's an example of this from the saga of the people of Eire, right? In the Vatnsdæla saga, the berserk gang disappears with prayer, but this prayer is carried out as a sort of magical conjuring. And this is fascinating because you see in the same Christian effort of conversion, however, a sort of compromise. Because part, and we know this from the history of chivalry, that this part of warlike value, the functionalizable one, was took on, in the Christian vision of knights. And also, for other signs and through other sources, it seems that the condition of warrior beast was accepted as a sort of disease, however. Right? This is not just about the Christian thing. It's also, yes, from Christianized context, but still homogeneously from backgrounds that were close to the original Nordic reality in the High Middle Ages, right? That condition of disease, misfortune, of heavy fate to bear, right? This is a dualistic concept that actually exists also in Christianity. Think about, the idea that you're blessed by God the more you suffer, or that responsibility entails, sometimes the necessity of sinning in order to do good, which is still a sort of, it entails a punishment. It's as if these two cultures, civilizations, and also actually the reality that stood in between, was identifying this pretty serious double-thread psychological acknowledgement of human existence. I mean, the idea that these were still harsh worlds and that somebody had to do some of the ugliest things. I mean, ask the military, right? It's not because those are ugly things they don't have to be done. Sometimes they must be done if you really want to do something good. And that's why we train our military to kill, because that's what they literally have to do. Otherwise they wouldn't be that. We wouldn't have a military. In the Vatnsdæla saga, one character, for example, complains being continually prey to berserksgang, to the point that he can no longer bear the attacks, quote, literally, of that sort of disease, right? It's something that I wouldn't easily associate it post-traumatic stress disorder, but to something similar. I mean, to the idea that if you are grown into a reality where the only way you have to cope with it is this, the way you shape your mind, especially since an early age, is to the exercise of violence, and you see some of the most unspeakable atrocities that mankind can ever witness, especially performed by your own hands on other human beings. The question is, you can hardly come out of that experience, psychologically speaking. That rage, that thrill of fighting, of blood, it's something that you have to replicate at some point. You know, people, I know even, people who have a thrill and say, I have to fight, I have to see, even in sports and games, I have to see those fleeing in front of me. I have to beat them. It's beautiful to unleash that rage. I feel the need to do it. And you say, but why actually? And sometimes you realize that behind it there is a history of sufferance or something that was not expressed that brought to that need, right? Because normally persons do not need that, right? And sport people are maybe understand because they understand the intensity, the physicality of it, because these were very physical realities. I mean, it's a sensation, but it's obvious that you cannot achieve that if you don't have a psychological motivation as well, right? It's not a purely mechanical function, and this at some point exhausts you, right? Enraging, having that kind of hatred, force of a bloodthirsty attitude. Think about the adrenaline it's consuming. You cannot stay. We know the military cannot fight more than an average military man. By our professional standards, it cannot fight more than a certain amount of days in his life, because otherwise he will be significantly crippled from a psychological point of view. Would not be able to perform as it should. And psyche is something very delicate. We constantly live, at least in terms of our biological base, in highly dysfunctional realities, so that every day maybe we accumulate, and over time we develop certain pathologies. We go astray, we fall in depression, we do not know how to cope with the situation anymore. We feel we lack moral resources, we feel we can't cope with that, and it's subtle because human mind is not entirely understood. It's not, at least the way we can fix it. We have dramatically improved our understanding of certain things, but it's still, quite important to realize that there is also behavioral dimension in this that makes the thing down. So, as ugly as it sounds, this might have been the reality of our ancestors, but it's surely not a good reality. The weight of this was deeply felt. And when societies began to achieve a bit more, right, not to have to live like this every day for survival, they began to acknowledge the burden of this lifestyle, right? And so that ever less people would be needed even just for being that, and therefore also it's in here that we can spot this figure emerging even in a negative fashion, right? I don't know, the Egil's saga, for example, tells us of Ulfr, that naturally means wolf in this regard. He's a berserker who, now retired, a retired berserker, right? So technically he has come back to the world. He's a farmer, right? And he's a good man, telling the truth, whose nature nevertheless sometimes has the upper hand. The thing comes back, especially at night. Therefore, rumor has it that he is, quote, someone who undergoes metamorphosis, a, quote, wolf in the evening. Right? And the obscurity of this concept is, literally, if you have been a berserker, you have ripped human beings alive with your own hands. And that's that damage I was talking to you about before. It's not that you forget about this. Even if you live in high medieval Scandinavia, where surely better than 1,000 years before, but that's not a good, healthy status. And this transformation is acknowledged as such. Right, this guy is supposed to have been reintegrated into a normal life collective. How most of the most of the people in the community would leave, and yet rumors that there is this dark side taking over. And it's a thrill, right? It's a lifestyle. If you've lived yourself in the wild, praying, killing, right? How do you reintegrate this person? It's not easy, right? Especially in a stateless world, telling the truth. So that where authority is just barely starting to form something capable of stemming these individuals. So, and exactly for that starts demonizing them in a sense. So even more evident and more dramatic is this long and beautiful episode of Sigmund and Sinfjötli, where it is possible to glimpse the internal elements of the secret society of the berserkers, right? So the warrior community, which an elderly initiator, remember Achilles with Charon, right? And a young initiated stand out, right? This is the story of Sigmund and Sinfjötli. The vagrancy and the extra-legal condition on which, and exactly here the most serious ambiguity plays, right? Because once again, who is an outlaw? What's an extra-legal condition? Here, there must be a community that defines that. And here you find the transition we were saying before. Because the formula is more or less the same for these men, but it's just the community that changes in regards to them. There's naturally the presence of a magical element in the form of the skin that once worn binds, literally, to the feral condition, right? The condemnation of this condition from which one cannot go out, right? This is an oppressed, this is a possessed, this is a serious, this is a pathological thing, right? Let's be honest about it, and which leads to crimes which repel the unfortunate man forced to commit them. These are forced. I don't know if you ever listened to criminal psychology, to interviews, to serial killers, and stuff like that. I mean, sometimes they strike you because you realize they're not even crazy. Like, what does crazy mean? That's the point. You don't know which path the human mind takes. These people were like that, and to some standards, for those worlds, it was even normal, right? But the human mind has a dramatic power. It's the most underestimated and overlooked power in the history of the world. Our mind can do incredible things, for better, for worse, right? Unfortunately. Or fortunately, who knows? Because if there wasn't this extreme, we wouldn't even maybe be humans. We wouldn't have accomplished something. We would have not had the capacity of distinguishing what is to be done to effectively change a certain state. So, Sigmund and Sinfjötli are father and son. Sinfjötli is, in fact, the result of an incest between Sigmund and his sister Signy, who magically deceived his brother to join her and thus provide with the Volsung's lineage with a scion that, coming exclusively from their blood, is a perfect instrument of future revenge, around which the fulcrum of the saga revolves. Or remember that these stories usually end with the tragic death of the hero, right? So just the mindset of these cultures is normally the idea that, yes, you can have a glorious life, but at the end of the day you die in some also kind of horrifying way, right? Sometimes even in a say dishonorable way, for an evil that is intrinsically there in these stories. You see here that it lays at the base of all the plot, right? There is something wrong since the beginning, and this, from a psychological point of view, is a very deep cultural realization of the disease that this reality brings to. We know from the migration era art what kind of 6th century Germanic mindset could be. These people lived thinking that to live in a world where there were, universal snakes tearing apart people with limbs scattered everywhere, things of an extreme violence, that we know changes when they began to settle in other worlds were more, prospered. They had more resources. They changed their life. They sweetened this kind of a vision of the world. It's obvious, but that tells you what they came from at the root. You can't, having started a glimpse of those things, you unfortunately would have not liked to know. And of course, in this story, both protagonists ignore the fact that they are father and son, right? However, it also and obviously establishes a very close link between the two, which is superimposed on the ethical link of the comitatus, of these bands of warrior devotees, and also the ethical pedagogical link of the instructor-student relationship, right? These young men, when they joined this brotherhoods, learned things the hard way, but it was also properly a technical skill. I mean, it wasn't just a technical skill, it was a learning about certain formulas, certain traditions, certain legions, right? They lived within these ideals, right? They were taught, they were educated specifically into this world. That's what educate means etymologically, so to exducere, to literally bring out of this man this capacity of doing those things. So these relationships are already implicit in the comitatus as we know it, to the extent that different age groups meet, veterans and young people. Remember the regeneration thing, right? Every year, normally these men flocked into this world at the good season, right, in spring, where they could start raiding cattle and raping women and killing their opponents in most atrocious way. So every year there would be the sedimentation of new people that were ever younger, right? And the others would die out gradually, but they would pass down this knowledge to the other. And dramatic martial skills as well. We know, as we were saying before, in the Viking era, certain berserkers were, yes, they were so individually skilled. They weren't just about their fear, but they also knew that they were excellent swordsmen, for example. They were starting to specialize in that world, so to literally also a bit secularize and to be less violent, we could say, right? The rape thing, like we could say in the Romans, the Sabines, is in the ancestral vision of it. It's this deep pulsion of the idea: kill your enemies, take their women, and of course, also the Viking era towards the end, it was gradually starting to form kind of proto-Stadal reality. It was adjusting, so it wasn't so radically wild, in spite of the astonishing amount of sheer violence you could find in those realities. So, but coming back to the story in short, Sinfjötli is entrusted to Sigmund so that he makes him a brave warrior. Sigmund is, however, an outlaw, right? He leaves Eden because otherwise his brother-in-law, King Siggeir, the exterminator of the Volsungs, would have him killed, since he is the son of Volsung himself. So this is also important because it shows you that there is the idea that there is a powerful king that is starting to marginate these other lineages that sometimes literally also have to start to live as outlaws, right? This is an interesting perspective on how even the berserker could be produced, because it's not just a primigenial connection. Here we are definitely detached from that initial functioning of the young man sent in spring out. This is something different. Here we have lineages, we have that surely also function similarly to that, but here we're talking about elites clashing, essentially, and these are histories of elites, right? This is important because Germanic society before wasn't about lineages, or ideally, yes, there was this idea of the stock, the thing, but we're heading towards an increasingly oligarchic society. Now, Sigmund's job is to raise Sinfjötli to avenge the Volsung lineage. One day, wandering to get food, other interesting things, this guy hunt like ferocious animals themselves, like predators, because they are predators. The two come across a house where two enchanted princes live, and they each have, surprise, surprise, a large gold ring and a wolf skin in which they live. That is, they're not so much disguised as wolves, they are real wolves. Once every 5 days, though, can they resume their human form. This is also fascinating because it tells you that there is, it's not a perennial state. These people can resume their humanity at some point. Right? There is a contact. You can imagine this, as we were saying, in the mid-Viking era, these bands of berserkers were literally hired by the most powerful kings. They were men of the world, and evidently they weren't just provincial outlaws. They were people who made a living and a lot of money and power with that. So they had to have some contact with the reality. Here, naturally, the story is a bit, the magic, the poetry of this beautiful Nordic cultural, background, this artistry, this literature, it's very fascinating, of course. You can imagine what Northern Europe was in those times, just even think of landscapes and environment, fantastic. And a lot of wilderness, as you understand. So Sigmund and Sinfjötli fatally happen to be there one of those days when the princes have resumed their human form and eventually come back in the wolf one, right? And they find, in fact, the empty skins, and they enter them themselves, thus falling prey to magic, right? They use the skins themselves. So in other words, they acquired the nature of a wolf in its entirety. They understood its language, they assumed its attitudes and ferocity, without losing at the same time nature and sense of men. They are condemned to be wolves, not just to have the appearance, and this leads them to perform acts of ferocity which they are unable to avoid. Sigmund bites Sinfjötli in the throat, then takes him to the hut and, quote, sitting beside it, cursed the wolf's robe. Only with the fire, the spell of the feral skins ends. This thing of the proof of the fire, remember, also in the judicial trials, in the sacred fire that of the Indo-European religions that could create and dissolve that vow. Right, there must be this passage through this initiatic step, right? This passage through fire, through it's a death, right? So the punitive and desperate character of such a metamorphosis is perhaps well understood. In the Edda, it's hoped for a perjurer who has committed murder to change into a wolf. There is an obvious negative stigma attached to this, right? And that the feral nature is something uncontrollable is attested in the sagas by the constant reference to a deeper nature, a sort of innermost soul, possessed by men but not controlled by him, and which materializes in dreams and visions in the form of an animal. Right? I think of Paul de Diegon's Historia Langobardorum 334, where the pet in the form of a reptile emerges from the mouth of King Guntram, right? The idea that there is literally an inner alter, right, in that can take over at some point. It's feline nature. This is a deep metaphor of the nature of man, right? We all have that. Ares is within us, right? It's the most instinctive and natural attitude. Our most instinctive and natural attitude is not to be intelligent and rational. It's to be brutal and violent, emotional and violent. This is how man evolved from that, right? That's also how literally the path of civilization has taken form, right? Before, we all lived like that. Our emotions and violence were functional to the fact we had to live in a world where we were able to kill a man from a 3-second distance, and we still have that in our genes. And these people were trained a lifetime to be like that. Now, coming back to it, they wouldn't be able to do without, because you need to teach, to train yourself not to be like that. That's why we educate people to be good, to be just, to be literate, to use their minds, because were we to literally listen to what we have inside, we would lose a great deal of what we have accomplished, right? And this was being, and this is the depth of the psychological realization of these cultures. They were starting to realize that there was something more that could be done. That this was not the answer, right? But it's not everything as well, right? In the same way, it's the feral. Still, there is a positive meaning of this all. That's where the sympathy, the innate, the instinctual sympathy towards this instinctive side is still within us. Let's be honest about it. It's the most evident, natural tendency of our mind, right? In the same, it is in the feral form that the protective genius of a family, of a tribe, of a people is manifested. Think about the totemic character that should be, of heraldry, right? The legions around, for example, the Visconti viper or the Orsini bear, literally. Think. Even my name actually comes from bear. My surname. I mean, it has. We have them. It's our name. It's our world. It stems from that world, right? And unlike the personal demon beast that is being portrayed in here, for reasons that you understand are political, the Volsungs there were pretty, were in a messed up situation at a social level, right? But speaking of family, this animal is usually beneficial. I keep quoting Paul the Deacon of the Historia Langobardorum. There were, as you know, the Longobards were literally Woden's adoptive sons. And Paul the Deacon, that was a Christian in the late 8th century, is famous for mentioning this mysterious wolf that had accompanied his great-grandfather to the land of his ancestors, that was also lovely watching over them, right, in the process. So there is obviously also a human character to this. Remember, Saint Francis is able to win the wolf. It's not killed. It's convinced. He has an intelligence of his own. There is a love, and these are we share so much with animals ourselves. So certainly, who doesn't like wolves? Let's be honest. They're awesome, right? The comparison between the captive warriors from the Iron Ring and the later wolf warriors or bear warriors, apart from the absence in the former, of the strictly animal component, and also the distance in time and environment between the sources that respectively speak of it, might not convince due to a basic divergence, because in Tacitus, the warriors through the ring are functional to the captive society, even if they live in an atypical way, of course. In the sagas, instead, of course, came much later, the berserkers are warned as dangerous outlaws, right? So in the first case, the feeling inspired by the captive warriors are of fear, but also reverence for the Germanic community. In the second, there is terror and repulsion. You understand the step that was taken by this world at 1,000 years of distance. So two factors may have played in this evolution that are clear. We hinted at the beginning. On the one hand, the overcoming of tribal society towards forms of coexistence under more centralized powers. More discipline, more order, authority. You can't do whatever the freak you like, right? Tribal societies are not good, right? There's no a real public authority. There is a community that basically stands together to keep doing what they want, right? But basically means that there are still the most powerful people within that do whatever they want. It's like the mob, right? And when a monarchy starts taking over, and with all the consequences of it, this makes the continuation of separate warrior brotherhoods dangerous, right? Because what's the difference even of an 11th century knight in a brigand? They're literally the same thing. They live in the same exact way, right? And this transformation took a hell of a long time. On the other hand, we have Christianization, of course, that backs naturally the rise of monarchies, and in a positive sense, because it says, realize that, I don't know, one thing among the others, that slaves are human beings, for example, that, we can have a kind of a peaceful coexistence, that we can cooperate at a community level without, unnecessary bloodshed, and without everybody doing whatever the heck they like. That's why the conversion here passes through the establishment of more central powers. And this naturally has effects at the level of customs and law, within which figures as disturbing as those of the warrior beasts do not fit well. And it's self-explanatory, right? Functional overcoming, also on the one hand, cultural change on the other, thus. However, it seems, of course, that the very persistence of the theme of the warrior beast, albeit demonized in late literature, is proof of the fact that the cultural framework relating to it has lived for a long time. And alongside the ritual function proposed by Dumézil, we were mentioning at the beginning, or rather together with it, these outlaws or lawless, had to have a precise social function, right? That of constituting, as we've seen, a chosen troop, right? Or defending their people in exceptional circumstances, of solving perhaps the most desperate military cases, right? These were the shield breakers. They had the ones who, as we've seen, would charge first, and we've seen many times how in Germanic warfare, most of their, it was largely overwhelmingly infantry armies. Cavalry was important, telling the truth as well, but it was mostly about this bulk and, breaking through the enemy at the beginning. At the hardest you can hit was along the battle line. The most, important thing, that first charge, to pick literally the best to do that. And still, Paul the Deacon, again, by his own times, understood, or at least pretended to understand, very little of the pre-Christian customs of his people, that he loved a big deal, and that documented also relatively to their pagan values, but now he was a Christian and a deacon specifically, but also had a brother who could rise in revolt against Charlemagne, right, and even accomplish something. So that is the warlike mindset is still out there, narrates that the Longobards, faced by overwhelming enemy forces, once during their migration pretended to have, we will explain this, to have dog-headed men in their own camp, spreading the news among the enemies. That such men were so ferocious beings that they drank blood, right? That would terrify the opponents, and when they also when they didn't have any available blood of others, they would drink their own, right? Now we do not understand whether that own means in the sense of literally their own personal blood, or the one of the members belonging to their own group, right? So the passage is Historia Longobardorum 1:11, right? Cynocephalos id est canini capitis homines. And Herodotus in here already spoke of the right of drinking blood with regard to the Scythians, that, even their steppe nature were close to those initial Indo-European practices. And it is true that this presentation of the Cynocephalus takes up from Pliny the Elder and Isidore of Seville in Paul the Deacon, but in this case the learned references do not serve to explain too much, because first of all, why were dog or wolf heads chosen for the story of the Longobards in this case, and why was it thought that the enemies would be really frightened by them? Moreover, in what sense, this detail would have been deemed to be likely, right? Something plausible in the for an 8th century audience, right? And how much credibility would the description of their appearance, their ferocity, and their mournful thirst have had if it had not been anchored to a common hinterland of traditions which Paul evidently ignored, or on which he preferred not to linger too much in his Christian pen, let's say. So on masks, anthropologically, were well documented. These are uses that date back to prehistoric times. As for drinking the blood of enemies, whether human or feral, it was common elements in war magic, right? So was drinking one own's blood, that is that of friends, right, of artificial brothers, the oath of blood, and within that speaks for the extreme connection that these brotherhoods had within themselves, because they were one. They were meant to act on the field as one. They were all brothers, literally. And there is interesting evidence of this in the same Longobards at some point, even in later times. This idea of the adoption by a powerful lord, so that would teach these kids to be, maybe they had remained orphaned because their fathers had died in war, in combat. They had to be trained as the new generation of warriors. So this is present exactly at the time of Paul the Deacon in Longobard Italy. So within the framework of what has been said here, therefore, the passage of Paul the Deacon on the Cynocephali is far more credible and less naive than we may hope for. It was understood properly that the role of these masks was literally to scare the enemies. But at the same time, it's likely that the encircled Longobards in the story had to recourse to a secret brotherhood of chosen warriors, that they have, so to speak, evoked the beasts that slept in some of them. This is deeper than, because you see that, as we have seen, it's a pretty universal value. These guys could have such brotherhoods. They would, here, it's important. It should be important to contextualize the fact that the Longobards were migrating. So they were, in the story, they were transitioning from a state from the same state that would bring them from the Zippe to the Comitatus. You know that the Longobards were deemed, even by Roman sources, to be basically the most ferocious of the Germanic peoples, because of their warlike, the fact that they took pride for being constantly at war for every neighbor. Other Germanic tribes were not like that. They were consistently the most ferocious documented, and they were even real. Like, their ethnonym is witnessed since the times Tiberius met them on the Elbe during the invasion of Germany, and we know the story that we get from later sources, the Italian ones, are actually coherent with that context. And the question is, that they were getting into a world of war, right? We know that Scandinavian society, paradoxically, was more peaceful, right? It was more Zippe-like than continental Germany at the time. So these people, during migration, take on these beast form to start frightening the enemies, but also it's likely, of course, that such practices were used also in Scandinavia, like in any other place, and that these migrating tribes would recur to these brotherhoods in the moment in which they were faced with challenges, right? So, actually, Paul the Deacon seems to say something very, very correct. Right? Even the masks, the fact of the dog. First of all, what's the difference between a dog and a wolf in these stories? Like, because at the end of the day, dogs were wolves at the time, and also the fact that there was a mask that was put on. Right? Paul the Deacon is very proud of his ancestry, and he cares after all. Right? And he may kind of highlight. I mean, the fact that this story is so mysterious in itself, it's because it left unsaid so much that probably at his times everybody knew in the memory of these traditions, and it's realistic. It doesn't say that these were actual dogs/wolves. It says that they put these masks on. So it's even a rationalizing and intelligent and realistic acknowledgement. And here it's also fascinating that Longobards are not even said whether they used it or not, right? They're just told to have threatened their enemies to do so. That is, look, that if you don't let us pass, we will come up with the wolves, and you know what it means, right? And of course, the Longobards eventually make it, and this makes the thing even more meaningful because it shows literally the psychological effect here. So it's a hell of a passage telling the truth. The Historia Longobardorum is a beautiful work. So the features of a primitive Germanic religious warrior costume therefore begin to show themselves, not without gasps of uncertainties here. Germanic society knows differentiated groups of warriors, endowed with their own particular sacredness, that is in such a part dangerous, in part useful and necessary. Right? They are a group of initiates who are also distinguished externally by the use of characteristic emblems, specific behavioral characteristics, an atypical kind of life. Their community, their herd, is on the fringes of the civil consortium that also expresses them. But speaking of outlaws, to Court may appear to be an imprudent and one-sided interpretation based on belated testimony. On the other hand, let's be clear, in the end, it had to arrive. Also in Nordic societies, the most conservative of these and other German pagan customs, with the extension of super-tribal and then royal authorities on the one hand, with the progress of Christianity for the other, and in fact, in juridical texts, or rather juridical interpreted texts, we arrive to the very significant equation of the concepts of wolf, a bandit, proscribed, outlaw, in short, friedlos. Because of his crimes, society has deprived of the Friede. That is, it has placed himself out of contact with that intimate force which ensures the peaceful development of the orderly life of the Sippe, and which translates adequately only on the external level with the Latin pax. So there were outcasts. There were people who did not accept the new authority, who would prefer a more traditional way of life, and that were, however, doomed to succumb, because that authority had developed with a shared political and social base. And the reason why they wanted to stay out of that is because they wanted to keep their own ambiguity, their personal power, prestige. That's what the warrior is, and where the citizen very remotely, although here, starts to emerge on the other side. So there is no doubt that the relationship between the wolf and the malefactor then passed to everyday language, and it had a very profound primal meaning. Right? We have two Anglo-Saxon cases in which the Friedlos is said to have had the head of a wolf. Right? The outlaw seen as a beast in the Nordic area should be still studied in parallel with the figure of the outlaw as a coward or a perjurer, right? A beast because he's unworthy to call himself a man. This is also another option, because this society had always had a kind of a police over, the guys who wanted to take over, right? Think about we'll talk about the settlement in Iceland, but I mean, religion here, and also the pagan one, had controlled these societies. They were very scarcely stratified because they were, they were fundamentally poor from a material point of view. They didn't have enough resources to be centered in the hands of few. The Viking era change is a big deal, but still the Zippe tends to curb every individual who becomes too powerful, right? So this was already present at the time in which the berserker was functional as a for protecting, for military purposes, and now simply expands. And yes, it does expand because there are more powerful lords that start centralizing power, but at the same time, it's something that works mostly between this leader and the people, and in the between, there are oligarchs who still wanted to do as they wanted. Remember the Volsungs before. That's another way of seeing it. The fact that if you infringed the public rules, you were an outlaw in the sense that you had lost your honor as well. You had gone against public faith and religion, right? It was something deeply bad. And this already existed, as we were saying before, in paganism. You couldn't do whatever you want in those societies. Their roles were extremely rigid. The fact that they, first of all, they didn't have enough proper literature. The fact that we think everything was orally transmitted, or when even things were written down, says there were fewer rules. This has absolutely nothing to do with that these people were freer than in other worlds. It simply means that those worlds were simpler. They functioned the way they did without further regulation. But when these berserkers started, being pointed at in a negative sense, they evidently have betrayed also the community in a certain sense. This is how the thing has felt. So it is true that the presence of these herds of outlaw warriors was fatal, especially for those classes on whose shoulders the weight of production weighed. I mean, these brotherhoods of warriors, as we've seen before, were about, wiping out farmers, those who, the harmless, the defenseless of society, those who could be raided and couldn't defend themselves. They were the ones who paid for the violence of and raids. It was the farmers. And remember that in places like the Nordic world, as we were saying before, the society was not so stratified. I mean, the farming communities were still capable of mounting up their, the defenses and so on. Of course, there were other models taking place, but those models were exactly those who were rising above and therefore crushing the outlaws. It's that connection we were talking about before. So, again, it's very meaningful, right? That those monarchs would exploit the farming resources as well, but still would give an orderly system to this world. So finally, it is indisputable that the Friedlosigkeit was solemnly proclaimed in front of all the assembled people themselves, and had the value of a kind of civil excommunication that completely separated those affected by it from his people. And it is indisputable that the Friedlose tended to come together in gangs and to recreate among themselves a new basis of civil coexistence, obviously suited to their conditions as bandits, right, as forcibly strangers to their tribes of origin as well. They were outcasts. They were scum of society, but increasingly so, at least. And but all of these is quite late also in time. The testimony of Paul the Deacon, that was quoted shortly before, has presented us with characters who strangely resemble actually the Anglo-Saxon Friedlose, but belong to an earlier age. Like these are the important differences between Northern and Southern Europe. I mean, Paul the Deacon lived in a context where there was already very few room for the need of, that kind of lifestyle. Anglo-Saxon Britain, well, was surely closer. Now, especially also with the Viking waves that were to begin, was exposed to completely different realities. So, like Paul the Deacon speaks of the capum lupinum, or better caninum gerunt, right? They are a distinct and dangerous group, nevertheless not foreign or excluded from the Longobard people. Everything towards which they have a high function, right? Even that of extreme saviors, in a sense. They're saving the people from that danger at that point. They are somewhat they are with the people, but there's still something else, right? This is one. Furthermore, there is no doubt that in later sources, these disturbing feral warriors tended to be removed from the civil consortium, and conversely, the outlaws were compared to them, to the point that a new group had to be born, syncretist of both, and indeed, the Scandinavian sources would begin to constantly assimilate berserker and vikinger, with a meaning that, at least from the 11th century, assumes a clear and absolute character, right? Still, so the same, core would, same Vikings themselves as pirates fundamentally, because let's be honest, that's what they were. They assimilated themselves to the concept of berserker, that on land, let's say, would be properly an outlaw, right? And this is real, right? By the 11th century, Viking raids didn't stop, but they were either forced away, mostly on Scandinavia itself, or maybe to the east on the Baltic, where still the local political and social structures were less defendable, so they would find even their space in the Baltic crusades and so on. So it lived on, right? Some Vikings would actually transform into crusaders and go to the Near East or in Spain, right? So there is another way, but it's controlled now. So it's obvious that the outlaw at that point would be assimilated even to just they should think about countries where, especially these maritime activities were radically important, like Norway especially. All that lifestyle would be assimilated, would be disciplined. We have talked about this in many videos about the Viking era and the following centuries. We find figures of beast warriors or their last, say, phenomenology in other contexts that have been influenced by those military cultures as well. Think about the Scandinavian leader John de Vode, right? Vode stands here for Vod, is that fury properly. As Adam of Bremen said, Voden id est furor, right? Vut it is as furor, because Voden, Vuten, that's all coming from the same concept. Well, John de Vode was beaten in 1171, famously under Dublin. He was this famous warrior, right? He was defeated by the Anglo-Norman troops, where he was chopped down brutally. They were launched, and they would launch themselves in the midst of the fray. This extraordinary, this frenetic violence. And the Vode is, in this sense, Wood had this semantic shift, because he was translated as the foolish now by the new sensitivity of the time, but it was actually in the memory of Odin's fury, right? He was, when the idea that this guy was invaded by the Wood, right? In the Wood, back in the day, in early Germanic, it would have been, in that sense, as we've seen for the captive brotherhood of warriors, something to be revered. Now these guys were seen as the foolish ones, right? Also because objectively coping with an Anglo-Norman cavalry charge, with a berserker, tactic, this is, let me tell you, not an entirely good idea. I mean, it can do something objectively. There is much less difference at some point, even with the Anglo-Norman knights. but it's not a surprise it was defeated and killed, right? How in Dublin at that point, and Christianity finally managed to transform the man-beast into a case not only of absolute asociality but of possession in this picture. In the Vans della Saga, it is told coinciding with the arrival of Bishop Friedrich in Iceland, right, at the time of the Christianization of the island, of two berserkers. Right, these guys still wandered, right, in this Nordic world. You would find them. I mean, look at all the various hunters in places like the White Sea, the steppe. I mean, they kept leaving. These people were there in the far north. There wasn't much of a different lifestyle. I mean, many areas of Europe, you would simply, even today, up to a few generations ago, at least, how close might have been similar to these wars. At least certain lifestyles that we're completely dishabituated to, right? And in the story, those two berserkers retained the traditional traits of violence, right? Arbitrariness, uncontrolled anger, and they are in a relationship of obvious incompatibility within the remaining Icelandic population, right? They're not integrated with it. Let's also remember that, or not even like in Paul the Deacon, right? It was not many centuries after Paul the Deacon, but still, at least he was talking much earlier times. Also in certain sagas, however, the berserkers are still functional here. Instead, these berserkers are quoted in Iceland, disliked by men, as they demanded of them women and money by force. Now, you understand this. These guys want to live the same exact way they did before. They want women and money by force. I mean, I don't know if someone comes to you, wants your woman and your money. Well, it's not really nice, is it? So, and also, if these people refused to give them, they would challenge them to a duel. Now, this is fascinating because it doesn't tell them, they would simply kill them. Still, these berserkers know that they can't, they can't fool around more than much, right? Their vote must be already disciplined here because they realize that they can't simply go and take, right? They have at least to challenge them to a duel so that it's a mediated, legal way, right? They're said to have been barking like dogs, that they bit the edges of the shields and they walked in the fire with bare feet. So here we are. The thing of the shield biters is to find also in the Lewis chess pieces that we have commented also somewhere. But this idea that they walked on fire with bare feet is naturally, it reminds of methods that the criterion that the church would point out to say these are possessed by the devil, right? But here it probably stemmed from the fact that these guys were exposed to those radically violent not just lifestyles, but also initiatic rites that would of course make them do something atrociously painful without not that they literally were confined. I mean, some would, right? There are people who actually do on the ardent carb and things like that, but here it's a mediates literature. It can be it's obviously an adaptation, but surely they would have an astonishing physical resistance. So in this saga, the berserkers are treated as possessed by evil spirits, right? They are frightened by fire, however, at the bishop's advice, and they were nevertheless killed with a stick. Why? Because, quote, iron does not bite berserkers. Right? And here there is the connection here is deep with the violence of their lives, but also partly, in my opinion, with the thing of the iron ring, the idea that these guys, once they were blocked with that, say, they would go through everything, right? So they had to be killed also in an unconventional way. But killed they are, and they are also, their bodies are thrown into a ravine. So they are treated like human garbage, essentially. And maybe, at least in the way they were presented. They were brigands, and that's what they actually wanted to do. And here I think it's worth mentioning that the Christianization of Iceland has been renowningly a fast and smooth process. Like, it's not that it was imposed violently, as most Christianization actually wasn't at the end of the day, and especially in the Nordic world. It was a largely autonomous process, but also it happened. So also we have to thank that, because we have lots of sagas translated from this world, was fairly in fact traditional, but also accepted this passage in literacy quite easily. So we have think about Snorri Sturluson, or all the beautiful things that we fortunately have thanks to Icelandic literature, learned about those worlds and the sagas and so on, that are mediated. But at a certain time in these examples show that literally these people that were settling in Iceland, they wanting to create also an egalitarian society that was orderly, civil. Of course, they didn't want to know about these formulas anymore, right? And in fact, Iceland would remain an example of a very interesting, good, and considering the context on advanced forms of government and administration, right, based on freedom and autonomy, but also on order and the rejection of those models of lifestyle. Naturally, the Zippe, as we've seen, had always had a bit of the same spirit, right? But still, in the more violent continental context, and especially during the migration years, of course, the Comitatus side with these bands of brotherhoods had kind of retaken over, and must be understood also culturally, historically, in its legacy. Why? Even in the knighthood, in this process, such strong warlike military character remained, because indeed the pressure there was much higher, right? It's not a surprise before that, paradox, as we were saying, continental Europe was much more intensely warlike than Scandinavia, because from Scandinavia people would just leave. And in the ancient world, where we find there the canine thing of Paul Diakon and so on, it was the crowded place where all these Germans had migrated in, because there were richer lands. They keep pushing away the Celts, fighting all the freaking time, competing. It was ferocious. They needed this. That's where they mostly get this more consistently Vodanic characters. The same Longobards. The Longobards come out of Scandinavia in the story like the Vinili. They're not Longobards. They become Longobards because they are adopted by Odin in the first battle that they have to fight, and they devote themselves as an entire people in that case to Woden, and they assume this the long bear trait, that it was one of the typical ones of Odin also in the sagas and so on. Now, in short, what is necessary to believe is that the associations of warriors that are initiatic and secret, in the sense that they are founded on those ideals, that initiatory, sacred perception of also the unknown, of the external, even the transhuman. I don't know to say that, something between the deity and between life and death, right? That is the leitmotif of all the military brotherhoods that are sowing life and death, right? Think about the Valhalla and so on. Introduces a new solidarity principle into the Germanic tribal fabric, right? This was not something completely original, as we've seen. The fact that these guys start being detached from the rest of society is new. It's not original. It's already advanced. So that in Tacitus Germania, we see that already. Right, those were very early Germans, but at the same time, there was already that change, right, taking place. That differentiation. It's not about, or not longer, at least, a commonality of lineage, but it's literally a choice, right, based on warrior value, right, to join this, or still surely on a common ritual heritage, but still a condition, that a position, if you want to, that stayed out of the homogeneous and compact body of the various ethnic groups. These were something else. They wandered. They sold their services everywhere. They joined the Roman army to come back home in discharge. They would leave as warriors, right? And exclusively for that. And there is plenty of, we were talking about the Notizia Dignitatum recently. You find there how many of these groups with all the wolf symbols are to be found, and how hard they were, right? Look at the Battle of Strasbourg as well, what they managed to accomplish. So the boundary here between the let's say the transformation into animal there is not explicitated necessarily, but it's obvious, right? Because the whole ethos, the devotion to the deity of the band, was why that society existed in the first place, right? So once you entered that, you weren't free to come out properly. And even when these things naturally dissociated for some reason, the individuals would keep feeling like that because they had been so traumatized and brutalized and habituated to this, this life of sheer violence under any point of view, that of any kind of possible psychophysical abuse, that they couldn't come back as new, back into society, right? The warrior beasts have their own corporate spirit, which distinguishes them. Also because the models are shared. These are not all different things. I mean, the wolf, the bear, more or less they're the same thing. As we were saying before, it belongs also to many other people. So it's about those characters. It's about essentially predators, fighters, animals that have an even and ferocious side. But also, one of skill in a way. The Comitatus is created on this by grouping also young people from various peoples. This is for example, what happened in the case of Ariovistus during the Suebic invasion of Gaul at the time of Caesar, and that speaks beautifully for it. That, like, the idea that these guys toured around, right? There was a people at home with normal freemen, and said these guys were meant to make fortune abroad. It's a bit like the Vikings, objectively. Like the Scandinavians, it's not they liked the Vikings much themselves, because these were the guys who've made a freaking lot of money abroad, came back, they could buy military retinues in their own people, and that completely unhinged Scandinavian politics and society, and it was something extremely dangerous. No, they didn't like that, right? The average farmer that lived out, that didn't, right, he was still open to the concept, though, right? It's not, as we were saying before, there was much of an idea of public authority or legality. These people lived as they do. But still, Viking era was a big thing in unhinging, something that had remained with all the various changes, but in the essentials, a bit like that for centuries and centuries. There is surely also mimesis with respect to the initiatory warrior groups that stands at the base of other social organizations. But let's say that, as we were saying before, this belonged technically to the original peoples, right? That all together in terms of warriors that were fighting because of that spirit, of that impulse. Even an average Germanic freeman would have felt that Woden had made the fury descending in him while into battle, needing to fight with those terrible conditions as well. So, but these were hyper specialists in a sense, and made a more radical life choice, right? Then we've seen brigands too. But definitely the ethnic, social, juridical origin of the comitatus members of the individual comites could be varied, right? These people would come from many different contexts, also sharing. There is a properly, we've seen it also in the Formkrieg, it was a need for sharing military knowledge, experience. We know that the Germans, were Romanized in equipment, for example. Why? Also because many of them would fight in the Roman army. So these people, we know, they would come back home at a certain point. There are graves of Germanic warriors, in Denmark, that said, I was in life a Roman soldier. I was proud of that. And they would bring together with know-how, capacities, vision of the world, expertise. They traveled. One of the most overlooked things in history is the mobility of human beings, especially of individual ones. And this was a way for having always a fit number of warriors, right? This is, in terms of a military asset, is important for a people. Having somebody that you can recall, we can mobilize in times of need, like, those guys have seen it all and know what the hell that they must do. And we know that within even just the military population, there is just a very few people who develop certain capacity of killing instantly with no instinctive human compassion, right? It's usually psychopaths that literally do not understand human emotions, or people who had, for example, take care of their families from an early age and seeing their companions, kind of their family, they project a thing, and so they're able, even in the heat of battle, to go out there and kill for saving them. Here, it's probably something similar. I mean, of course, the brutality of those times would produce much more easily this kind of man that our societies do today, like that fashion. But obviously, you need that elite. You need that spearhead that, as we've seen also in Tacitus, is properly indicated as that. These guys were those who opened and closed the fight. So they were also, in a way, the most resilient, as you understand. And I would go as far as saying, and as it's recognized historiographically, actually, that the comitatus, in this sense, is and this original initiatic matrix, is the true and most direct mother cell of the cavalry, right? With this proud sense of being outside society, part of the best, in a group of the best ones, right? Of elite, of true elite, with this loyal egalitarianism within, because especially the early knights, as we've seen, came from the most different social backgrounds. They were literally brigands most of the times themselves. Just if they knew how to, they had a horse and an armor, knew how to fight, arms and knew how to fight. That's what made them a miles, I don't know, in the 11th century. By the 13th century, it had become something different, but still there was this atrocious sense of competition and promotion that political and social promotion that today maybe we haven't stressed so much, because we would say that berserkers in the negative dominant stigma we have pictured at the end of this period were not like just traditionalists in the true sense. I assume they might have been just like in the case of the Volsungs, they had to run for their lives because somebody had taken over. Those who had taken over had emerged through the same system. Right, the graduality of the passage between this brotherhoods of berserkers to brotherhoods of knights, because still brotherhoods they were, is very gradual. You can't even tell the exact difference, right? As you can't tell actually much of a difference between a Viking and a crusader at a certain point in Scandinavian society, because also the same mental categories of fate, of possession, but they would easily be shifted or simply syncretized from paganism to Christianity, because at the end of the day, that's how it literally happened. And over a time span, it could be centuries and centuries. And this is valid also for other realities. It's not just the Nordic world, right? So, at least when we will speak of knighthood, we will also take in consideration this what I think is a most obvious realization of the continuity between these models too. That maybe once again today we didn't stress excessively, but we're just trying to describe mostly the role in the Nordic society of these men. All right, I'm glad we talked about this today. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.